like always, either Jim Anderson or I are going to be here at Prairie Grange to talk about varieties and the data that we collected this past season on the variety trials and what that kind of means. So let's get started. Hindsight. I should have taken the is it dry enough for you off of there, but it's still, overall, we were very, very lucky with the recharge that we had last fall that started during beet harvest and the very late spring that was in a way very wet. Because for many of us, after that, during periods where we needed it, we didn't have any precip. So this is a really cool number. This is the state average in Minnesota. And if you remember, in the last couple of years, we were on a downward trend and a pretty hard downward trend. So we jumped 13 bushels in Minnesota on the state average. Now, in a way, you know, the year before we were very, very dry. But if you Melissa. Okay, there we go. Did we breaking bad luck with the 61 bushels? We can explain why it was low last year, but I cannot at this point explain why we were this high this last year, of this last season. I have no idea where the crop pulled this from. Because when it comes to, yes, we planted very, very late, and the month of June was ideal for initial crop development. As many of you would say, the wheat after tillering was thicker than hair on a dog. It was beautiful. But when it started to get into stem elongation and ultimately grain fill, I don't know if you remember, but you probably turned on the air conditioning because it was pretty sticky. High dew points mean high nighttime temperatures, and generally that doesn't bode well for us. You've heard me in the crop news reports talk about very high scab risk. The models were trending very, very high. We started seeing BLS relatively early, and that needs humidity to really get going. And again, high nighttime temperatures. Yet we pulled off what I think is an amazing crop. And I know of individual fields that went into the 3 digits. And I honestly, at this point in time, and I have some ideas yet. I've done this 10 years ago. In 2012, 2013, we had very similar scenario year over year. And I looked at that time, I could explain it with nighttime temperatures. I haven't had a chance yet to look at that data for this year. I will eventually get to that, but I'm running a little bit behind this year because it was a very late year. I was planting winter wheat trials and harvesting spring wheat trials in the same week. And so everything has been kind of compressed, and I just haven't had time to look at some of those things. I'm blown away. 100 bushel wheat at 15 Pro. Because everybody, most of you, cut back on your nitrogen. Because conventional wisdom is, if you start that late, don't spend your money on nitrogen. And they didn't give it away for free this spring. So there was another incentive not to be that liberal with nitrogen. And so then when you start seeing these yields coming in, the first thought is, okay, we're going to be at 11% Pro. And no, I already told you, 100 bushels in some fields with 15 Pro. And that's amazing. I don't have a good explanation at this point in time. So if we look at the newest stuff, South Dakota released Ascent. And this is really funny. So when we create names for varieties and we submit these ideas to the USDA ARS for the PVP application, they can't be similar. And we get told, no, you can't use that name because it's been used already in crop Y or crop Z, especially if there's an oat variety that was named, say, Ascent, you can't use it. What other variety do you know sounds very, very similar to Ascent-SD? LCS Ascent. The only difference really is the prefix and the T versus the D. I still don't know who allowed for this one to get through, but it is Ascent SD. Champions Seed came out with Recoil. Cropland has CPX 39120. LCS Ascent, like I already said, came out at the same time. We released Rotsay. Meridian has Charger new in the market, and NDSU released Heron. So if we look at the survey, I fully expected 9590 to be the top variety this season. And it came in second, and Torgy basically came in from the backfield all the way to the top in Minnesota. That was a very big jump and a very pleasant surprise for us. Lincoln's acreage has been going down as it should. Murdoch, a little decrease. Valda, a little decrease, a little drop in acreage. And then there is, Shelley is kind of hanging in there. And then we have Trigger Cannon and Wildcat making up the top 10 in Minnesota. But we were very pleasantly surprised that Torgy jumped this much in acreage. And then we got really nervous during harvest because we were looking at our heading dates, and because we started so late, we started looking at heading dates, and okay, things were kind of lining up. And then we started looking at harvest dates and how our trials looked around harvest. And one of the things we started to notice is it looked like Torgy was a little bit later and wasn't drying down maybe as quick as normal. We can't put our finger on it. And so we were really anticipating a lot of feedback from you, and we haven't heard that yet, that Torgy is a little quirky, maybe when planted late. I don't think it's overall going to be detrimental to it, but it is, if you've seen that kind of little difference compared to some other varieties that you've already had, head to head, I'm curious about what you're seeing. So, location summary. I averaged 96 bushels in Pearly. Mike, 96 bushels in Crookston. 14.6, 14.1 protein. Okay, there's a whole bunch of locations where we did not collect protein this year. Why? You ever have a 10-year-old combine and you have that one season where everything goes wrong with that 10-year-old combine and you're at the dealership every other day? That was me this year. We were running a skeleton crew anyway, and then we just playing with the late season, ran out of time, and we had to make choices. It takes me I'm about 20, 25% slower if I want to take a subsample. And so I needed to push faster and because I didn't have as many days. So we opted in a bunch of locations not to collect protein data. I don't like doing that, but it was just an outflow of what all happened this season, and I apologize for that. The lowest location, Morris, St. Paul, and those are known. The grain protein to grain yield ratio, I kind of looked at for myself okay, did we under-fertilize for the yields that we have? I like to be at the 0.2 or so, and you can see where in those top locations, we're below that 0.2, but the average protein in the trial was still high enough. Generally, when I start seeing it, it starts to trend down a little bit. And so I'm happy still with those locations. Okay, should I? Okay, so I'm going to have spare time probably. We can have some discussion because I'm still crunched for time, and so I don't have as many slides as I normally have to share with you. I was making this last night sitting at the airport in Tampa. You've seen this graph now for a bunch of years, and I keep using this one. This is the single year data in the north. Now understand, there's a bunch of locations with protein that aren't in here. So it's only the protein data of the locations where I had it and the yield of all the locations. As a result, this red line is probably shifted down, meaning that the varieties overall look better than they probably would if I had all the locations in this box for the on this side of on the y-axis. But the relative ranking, I think, especially if I look at the multi-year data, is still, I think everything kind of sorts out the way I would expect them to sort out. Now I see a bunch of frowned eyebrows. Should I explain why I have grain protein yield on the y-axis? You can just go like this if you don't want to raise your hand. Okay, I do not present anymore the classical grain yield versus grain protein on the y-axis. And the reason for that is twofold. All these varieties are treated the same when it comes to the amount of nitrogen in the trial, which means that I would automatically, potentially under-fertilize the high yielders because they need more nitrogen overall than a variety that doesn't yield as much to be able to generate the same amount of protein in that plant to get to 14. And so that's why you always see that inverse relationship between high protein of high yield versus high protein. As yields go up, average protein tends to go down. There's some underlying physiological reasons for that. Because it takes the plant more energy to make protein compared to starch. Okay? You fertilize not individual plants, you fertilize a whole area. Now, is there genetic differences in how good varieties are to eventually put that nitrogen that they took up on that acre, because you fertilized that acre, and eventually put that in the kernel? And there are differences in that efficiency. And so, similar to sugar beets, you get paid on sucrose per acre. Think of it this way, you get paid in a sense for the amount of protein that you can produce on that acre. Now, unlike sugar beets, you dilute that with starch, which is in a way why we always talk about 14 Pro. But as a breeder and as an industry overall, we need to move in both directions. So the better we do in climbing up this red hill, moving it this way, the better off we are. So a variety like Ascent SD is just better with nitrogen than CPX 39120 or Froberg or Ranchero. We need to move this whole cluster this way over time as an industry. Why? Well, A, nitrogen is expensive, and B, if indeed you are going to be limited in the amount of nitrogen that you can apply per acre, that becomes even more important. Can that happen? Can you get the government say, they shall not apply more than X pounds of nitrogen per acre? You think that could happen here? Good. If you nodded like this, I think you understand the dynamics. It had happened 30 years ago in the Netherlands. It has happened in this country. If you're in the Chesapeake Bay, it happened also 25 years ago. The fact that if you're in southern Maine, you no longer can apply nitrogen in the fall. That was a measurement to talk about nitrogen over time. If that doesn't work for what the goals are with nitrogen runoff off of the landscape, the next step is what? Limit the amount overall, period. So that's why I made a very conscious decision a couple of years ago. This is how I will always present that, because I want you to get used to the idea. Now, the market could give a rat's ass. No, it doesn't. It wants 14 Pro, period. The whole industry is built around. That's why there is this big red line. You're below the big red line, that variety wasn't at 14. Above the big red line, that variety was above 14% Pro. So now we can combine all those elements in your decision process. I can't do that in any other way. So that's why it's grain protein yield per acre. You don't have a choice with me, sorry. So, the second, so if we go back, so it's kind of messy in here, but look at varieties like Torgi, 94.79, 95.50 is in here too. Valda has dropped off in the last 2 years. Normally Valda would hang out here. Ascent showed up new. Trigger this year is pretty close to the red line. Normally Trigger hangs out kind of here. Linkert and Bowles always kind of hang out here. But we have a bunch of varieties normally, and I normally would expect this red line to be somewhere right around here. But as I said, I have fewer locations. The scatter looks about the same, but I think we're overestimating in general the varieties that could be above 14 in most years. The second thing that's really important to you is you hate surprises. You want the damn thing to do the same thing year after year. Well, if you listen to the talk this morning from Kevin, there is this thing, GEMS is a really beautiful acronym, but there is this genotype by environment interaction. And if you are in a greenhouse, I can minimize that. If you're in Northwest Minnesota, the saying goes, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, because it's going to change. So we have to contend with very large genotype by environment interactions every single year. Now, some people and some varieties just shrug and do their thing. Some varieties just falter, fall flat on their face, are miserable. I'm somewhat like those varieties, although I've been here now long enough that a 95-degree day after a 65-degree day doesn't kill me. And high humidity versus dry doesn't kill me anymore. And minus 40 doesn't kill me anymore. But I grew up in the Netherlands, where the temperature range is between 32 and 75. That's my comfort range. But I've adapted. I can now handle more genotype by environment interaction than I could in the past. Apart from the skeeters. So stability is important to you. Now, the challenge with presenting stability, there's a really beautiful body of literature on how you can measure stability. The challenge with those parameters is they're kind of difficult to present. And the second thing is we have this thing with protein. So I have to add a dimension to it. Okay, I don't know how you are, despite of me having a PhD, but the moment I have to go into the third dimension, my brain starts to freeze if I have one more up there. So I've tried to come up with a way to present this a little bit different. There's a method that talks about using basically not the actual data, but just the rank. So what I do now is in this case, this is 8 locations in the north. I calculate out this average rank. So Trigger pretty much was always number 1 in the trial for yield this past season across the northern 8 locations. Okay, that's not surprising. Linkerd pretty much always is near the bottom of the trial. Again, no surprise there. But there's a huge difference in the amount of grain protein between Linkerd, or protein percentage between Linkerd and Trigger. Linkerd actually makes, on a per acre basis, more protein than Trigger does. And so in that dimension of where you have to decide, well, I want to have a variety that has a pretty good chance of creating protein for me, where I don't run into discounts, where I have a bigger chance of running into discounts with Trigger, those are all these varieties in the middle. You know, Valdes in there, 9590 is in there. But this gets kind of a messy mess in the middle. Those are what I would call balanced varieties. So how can I compare? Because they are not the top here, and they're not at the bottom here, which are the easy ones. They're just in this big scatter plot. Okay, there's a bunch of statistical theory I will not bore you with. But if a variety is always number 10 in the trial, it's going to have an average rank of 10, and it's going to end up below the blue line. If a variety goes from number 1 to dead last, back to number 1, to somewhere in the middle, in those 8 locations, and that's the genotype by environment interaction, that's the changes, that's the variability, that's genotype by environment interaction, the unpredictability, if you want, it's going to be above the blue line. So anything, bottom line, if you never want to remember this again, all you have to remember whenever you see this slide, anything below the blue line is good. Anything above the blue line is not as good. So now I can compare apples to apples. In this middle group, Ranchero and Murdoch are completely different animals than 9590 or Ascent or Shelley or Driver. You have a better chance to be consistent year over year or from the Southern Valley to the Northern Valley if you chose 9590 or Driver over Murdoch. Doesn't mean Murdoch can't beat you on the farm, because to come out with an average rank of, say, 18, but having that much variability meant that there's a couple locations where Murdoch fell flat on its face. But it also had a couple locations where it did really well and gave Trigger a run for its money. Because that's the only way that graph can look this way. So you might have been absolutely really happy with Murdoch this past season. Okay, so why do we do yield trials? Not to prove the past. We do yield trials for you, so you have an idea what the variety can do next year. Is next year going to be the same as this year? Heck no. I hope not. Have I sampled next year already? No, I have not. But I sampled a whole bunch of locations in the whole area that there's a reasonable chance that some of those conditions we've already come across. Not on your farm, but somewhere in the region. That's why it presented this way. So, anything below the blue line, so varieties that are interesting: Shelley, Driver, Rotsay, Charger, Lang, Longmire, Barracuda, Trigger. Lincoln is a little bit above it, that's not surprising. Valde is a little bit higher than I've seen it in the past. It would kind of hang out here. Washburn in the north is a little bit more variable. Murdoch is very variable. Ranchero is very variable. 3119 is very variable. Less stable. Okay? Now, 1 year is only 1 year. Let's sample more environments, more years. So then we go to yield and protein plot over the 3 years. Now remember, there's two relatively odd seasons in there, 21 and 22 compared to 19. But look here, trigger and buster. They're the highest yielding varieties, period. But they're well below the red line, as you've probably noticed. Again, we're still a little bit biased because I have a bunch of locations missing. In this case, I think right now I'm underestimating maybe a little bit. Bowls linkered are above 14. And then there's this middle group. You know, and I want to be as high up as possible here. See how Prosper still hangs in there? Shelley is in there. Driver showed up. Washburn doesn't do good in the north, as good as it does in the south. Murdoch is here. Torgy is in this group here. 9590 is there. But these are much better overall. They produced about the same amount of protein per acre, just diluted with more starch. The closer I can get to this red line, overall, higher up, the better off I'm at a variety. And you have to manage those risks for yourself. Do I want to always stay above the red line? Or am I willing to kind of creep under that as long as I keep kind of close to that red line? Stability, because that's the second dimension of variety selection. Look at driver. This is commander. I don't know why, I haven't figured out which one this is. There's, for some reason, the graphing package decided to not put two names in, even though they're in the spreadsheet. Look at Murdoch. It bounces around. So in some locations, some years, it's phenomenal. And then somewhere in the same year, it is not. That's G by E. Bowles is always going to be there. Linkert is indeed there. Washburn is here. Shelley, Valda, Torgy in that middle group. Trigger and Buster are always kind of be in the top of as far as variety performance. Everything with me? Everybody with me so far? Okay, that's yield and protein. What about the diseases? This is bacterial leaf streak. Genetics are important in bacterial leaf streak because we do not have a control method, really. Fungicides do not control bacterial leaf streak. The 2.5 actually is a 2 to 3 rating, but I can't do the magic with the color sorting if I make it a 2 to 3 rating. So 2.5 is a 2 to 3 rating, 6.5 is a 6 to 7 rating. We're not completely sure yet if it's a 6, if it's eventually going to be a 6 or a 7. Gunsmoke is really bad right now for bacterial leaf streak in our data. We have a whole bunch of varieties that we think are pretty darn good, from Spitfire all the way up to 3915 from Cropland. Trigger is still up there as one of the best ones. Ascent is going to come in basically probably as a 2 eventually. Driver is a 3, Lang is a 3. There's a lot of choices where we can get good genetics for bacterial leaf streak. Likewise, the story is the same for Fusarium head blight. Lang and Buster, Trigger, Torgy right now are the top ones for scab. But I would not be afraid to choose any of the 4s in your operation. I get nervous here. You will not see 9590 in my picks. And the only reason for it, despite all the other metrics that I can show you, the stability of it, and the protein and everything else, and the straw strength, it's phenomenal genetics. But I cannot, and I have PTSD, because I started my career in graduate school and lost the first year of my thesis even to Fusarium head blight. And my career started with Fusarium head blight here in the Valley, 93, 94, 98. And so I'm very averse to having very susceptible varieties on the landscape. You have to weigh that risk. This year, you saw it in the crop news announcements. I was nervous as heck. Did it pan out? No. The risk models trended high, right at the wrong time. Did you see any fusarium damaged kernels when you were combining? Probably not. We couldn't find it. So maybe I'm damaged goods and you shouldn't listen to me when it comes to fusarium head blight. I'm risk adverse in this context. Because the fungicides only get us, when things are really, really bad, I think the fungicides will only get us part way. And it's the years where if 95-90 is a certain percent of the acres, and we have a moderate disease pressure and it's 4 ppm, the elevator can blend it away with all the other better stuff that comes in. If all of us are at 4 ppm and 95-90 comes in at 8 parts per million, that's when the wheels are going to come off and you're not allowed to deliver that grain. That's what I worry about. Okay, finally, the bottom line. How am I doing for time? Okay, bottom line, then we can open it for discussion. I'm still a lousy meteorologist, and so G by E is what it is. And so between bushels and protein, there's always going to be this force field, because that red line can move up and down in that scatter plot. So I still like mix and match. I don't think the whole variety, your whole farm should be in bowls or linkered, nor should your whole farm be in trigger. You can maybe choose your whole farm in Torgi, but even that I'm not a big fan of. I like mix and match, managing risk that way. So right now, and this is still evolving, right now we're thinking still keeping 35-30 in it, which doesn't have a lot of acres, but overall we like the package. The lodging score isn't good enough. It also is a patented variety. Driver we added. The only right now, and with 2 very dry and warmer years, the South Dakota germplasm all of a sudden starts bubbling to the top. If we stay in this pattern of drier, warmer grain fill periods, South Dakota varieties are going to do what they did in the early 2000s and start bubbling to the top. We added ambush. The disadvantage is that the bread making quality, not the protein, but the bread making quality of that protein isn't that great for driver. Linkered is a completely different variety when it comes to bread making quality. But you don't get paid for bread making quality. You get paid for the percent protein. Those are not always completely connected. But we have to mention to you, it's not the greatest for quality in the industry. Ambush we added because it has really actually a pretty good disease package overall, does reasonably well for yield, is a pretty stable performer. We added Rotse. Quality is a 5. Basically anything that had a rating of in one of those dimensions above 5, it's in the minuses. It's not a major one. I think Torgi is right now probably the most all-around variety, except for that little quirk that I talked to you about that we kind of are worried about. I'd like to hear from you what your experiences were with Torgi, if you saw that this kind of delayed harvestability. CL 611, which is a Clearfield variety, also is a very general, overall decent performer. It doesn't have a lot of acres, but it's a middle of the road, good, decent variety. And I keep Valda in it, despite the straw strength issues, because it's one of those that has been really consistent. And either AP Smith and Murdoch are not Valda. I think that's the fairest assessment of those 3, because they're very comparable. Longmire is a different issue. Longmire is really the only one we have for solid stem, for wheat stem sawfly. But the expression of the solid stem trait is finicky, which anybody that works on wheat stem sawfly will tell you. Expression isn't always guaranteed, even if you have the marker data and everything else. This year, I saw very good expression of the solid stemness in Longmire, and that in way coincides with what the literature says, that under warmer conditions during grain fill, that stem expression is better. So with that, any questions? And in very small print, comments, disagreements? No. We can have a discussion. Tim?
Could you comment on straw strength and where you ended up with like Rossi ranking that?
Rotse, not off the top of my head, but Rotse is going to be, I think it's going to be a 3, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't put that slide in. I should have maybe. It's better than Torgi. It's closer to Linkert. But I don't know if we gave it a 3 or a 4. Yep.
So the issues you saw with Torgi this year, you hadn't seen them before?
No, that's called genotype by environment interaction. We've had, 19 was a little bit later, but we didn't see it then. This was a very late year, and all of a sudden, it looked a little different than we've ever seen it in the trials. And so that's when you get now and then unpleasant surprises, which is why I'm posing the question. I don't think Jim is more worried about it than I am. I think it's relatively minor, but you could see it in the trials. But all of a sudden it was later than it had been in previous years. And so let me know.
Did you plant any winter barley in your plots?
Yes. So in the on-farm trials, there's trials co-located. So in the south, Rochester, Le Center, Becker, and sometimes Benson, and Fergus, I have. And then on the north, I have the spring barley, and Stephen, I have oats. Fergus, I have oats and regular barley. But in the south, I had winter barley added to the winter trials. So I have winter rye, winter wheat, and winter barley trials in Rochester, like I said, Le Center, Becker, Crookston, and Roseau. I'm really good yet at killing winter barley. I can get it, some varieties through the winter, like Equinox. I can get through the winter, but you would still rip up the stand. We're not there yet. They're not winter hardy enough for us. And if you would do it in commercial production, you would absolutely only do it in no-till. Don't even think about anything else but no-till, because if there's no snow cover, you're DOA, dead on arrival. I'm harsh that way because you go like, well, you should try it. No, the risk is too great. You have to be willing to, if you do winter barley as a grower, I will tell you to have a plan B and have the seed bought for those acres. This isn't, oh shoot, I should. No, you have plan B in place, period.
We're just getting back to that Torgi a little bit.
Yeah.
We're in North Dakota, north of Devil's Lake, and, it went down.
Well, bugger.
And then, the lateness was really a concern.
Okay.
But, you think planting date will change all that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And so when I say G by E, it means that something in the environment was different that allowed for a differential expression of something to where the ranking of the varieties changed. That's really what genotype by environment interaction is. And so one of the things, and now we're getting deep into the genetics, and this is a little bit of a postulation, aka Jochum is taking a scientific wild-ass guess of what the origin of this behavior is. Most of our spring wheats have a little bit of winter wheat in them. And with that, because crosses have been made back and forward, and there is, the gene is called vernalization, VRNA, B, or D, which is, there's 3 genomes in wheat. VRNA is very present in all our spring wheats. And for some reason, when they have the combination with RHT2, which is a semi-dwarf gene that we have, we've seen some, basically, the spring wheats that have that combination are almost acting like a winter wheat and head earlier if they get a colder spring. But if you very quickly go from planting to warmer conditions, and they don't have that colder first couple of weeks, they don't get that cold, accumulation of cold units, and they act differently. A very good example of that variety was Kelby. Kelby would do that. So there is genetics that we don't necessarily always understand. And in most years, you would never notice it until you get a year where those average conditions are just a little bit outside of the years that you tested it, where you start seeing those rank changes. And this is a purely speculative, scientific, wild-ass guess, and you can never cite me on it.
Just a quick question on, like, some of the cropland varieties you see, especially like 3099, seem to be racehorse, tremendous yields, but is it the disease packages that scare you a little bit?
Yep, and in some of those, the very, very late maturity. They almost make harvest for me impossible because they're still green and standing there when I have my earliest varieties starting to break down. And so now I all of a sudden have to go, do I have to do maturity groups for a variety trial? I don't want to. I think they're a little bit too late for us. We have to get more experience with them to really say that they fit in the mix for us. They also have shortcomings on, for instance, the leaf diseases. Now, we can take part of that partially with fungicides, and some of them we haven't had in there long enough. Remember, I have a standing rule. I will not talk about a variety until I have 3 years of data. Because then I feel I have sampled enough locations to have somewhat of an informed opinion, because that's what the picks are, to have them show up in that list. And some of these we've only tested now for 2 years.